How's it going, everyone? It is I, Anime Outlet, and this is part 1 of What If Deku was the son of Nezu. And now, before we begin, I would just like to ask you all to please consider subscribing, as it really does help this channel out, and you can even be notified when the other parts of this series and other series do end up coming out. And now, let's begin. To start this what if off, we see Izuku swinging his legs back and forth, sitting down on a chair. As we zoom out, we see that he is inside of a doctor's office, more specifically a quirk doctor's office, as the young Izuku is 4 years old exactly as of that day. As he would be swinging his legs back and forth, he would look over towards his dad, Nezu, who was sitting right down next to him. "Dad, what do you think my quirk's going to be?" he would ask excitedly, still jittering around, just violently shaking in his seat as he just couldn't wait. Nezu would put his paw to his chin before thinking for a moment. "I don't know, Izuku. That's quite the question," Nezu would say. A little more backstory on Izuku is that he is the son of Nezu, and that his mother is just out of the picture. She is absent, and presumably might have died in some sort of villain attack. However, Izuku and Nezu don't know for sure. At least, Izuku doesn't. Nezu knows Izuku's way too young to just tell him what happened to his mother. The quirk doctor would walk out to see the two sitting down, as he would then motion for them to stand up, signaling them for him to come with him. "Izuku and Nezu, please come with me," he would say, as they would then walk to a doctor's office or a private room, where they would then sit down as the doctor would take a couple of tests, x-rays, before he would end up sitting down with Izuku, looking over his just clipboard with all of just the information. "Great news, Izuku. It appears you will have a quirk, and quite the fairly strong one at that. I can't say for sure what your quirk's going to be, but I know it's going to be something good," you would say, smiling at Izuku, as Izuku would jump up in the air with his All Might action figure in hand, pumping it up. "Yeah! I can't wait to be a hero!" he would say, as the doctor would only just laugh. "Good luck on that, Izuku." The doctor would then look over towards Nezu with a cold just look before handing him some paperwork. "Here's your paperwork, Nezu. Just telling what Izuku's quirk could possibly be and just what we think it would be. Or you can also tell us what it's going to be, so when we have to write it down on his quirk sheet," the doctor would say. Nezu would nod as they would then end up leaving. We now see Izuku sitting in the UA building, as it was just in the middle of a school day. As Izuku would be sitting there swinging around in the office chairs, Nezu would try to calm Izuku down. However, Izuku would say that he couldn't calm down. "He's going to get his quirk today. If not today, it's going to be tomorrow," he would say with an excited grin on his face, as Nezu would only just laugh at him. "Yeah, hopefully your quirk's quite the strong one, you know," as Izuku would nod his head. Nezu would end up asking one of the teachers who didn't have any classes that day to come take Izuku and just to go around playing with him, possibly just throws type of ball around, just to get all of the energy out of the young Izuku. The teacher would walk in before nodding their head, as would then take Izuku out, where Izuku would end up just looking around at all of the wildlife around him, as he would end up just pointing at a small stray cat that was hiding behind of a tree. Izuku would say that the cat looked cool, and just without thinking, Izuku would suddenly transform into a cat right before the eyes of the teacher. The teacher would look on just in amazement, as Izuku would end up looking down at his body with his paws now in front of him. So he would say, "Huh, I'm a cat now?" He would say, questioning himself, as the teacher would look down at him, hearing that the cat started to meow, as Izuku now unlocked one of his quirks. Yes, you heard that right, he had 2 quirks, one of them being an animal quirk, allowing for him to turn into any animal, and the drawback is he just couldn't communicate with the rest of the people, as it's just in his own just language. Say if he was a cat, he'd be meowing, when to himself he'd think he was actually talking. So he really just couldn't communicate to anyone when he was transformed, unless he was talking to some sort of animal or giving off some sort of noise to that animal. So with Izuku there, he would suddenly transform back before hopping around, yelling excitedly that he unlocked his quirk, that had finally awakened. Izuku would end up thinking of another animal that he had saw just in the books that he had been reading, as it was a great hawk, as he would end up turning into this hawk before flying around, before landing back onto the ground, turning back to normal. He would pump his fist up into the air, yelling that so excited that his quirk's awesome. The teacher would quickly grab Izuku's hand before hurriedly pushing him back to Nezu's office, where the teacher would yell towards Nezu, "Your son, Nezu! He unlocked his quirk!" Nezu would stand up, pushing the chair off behind him, hitting the wall. "Wait, really? What is it?" he would ask, as Izuku would proudly exclaiming, "It's this!" he would say, turning into a small kitten before jumping up on Nezu's desk. Nezu would look on in amazement down at Izuku. "That's great! So, now that you unlocked your quirk, why don't we begin some training?" Nezu would say towards Izuku. Izuku would look towards Nezu, his father, wondering what he meant by that. "Training? What do you mean?" "Well, you are at the Greatest Hero School, of course, and your dad is the principal of it, so why don't we get training you so you can become the greatest hero of all time? You could become just like All Might. How about that, Izuku?" Nezu would say, as Izuku's eyes would widen, sparkling at the same time. "Wait, really? You really mean it?" Izuku would say, pumping his fists back and forth as he was just so excited. This day just couldn't get any better. As Nezu would end up laughing, "Yeah, so why don't you go ahead and start giving some basic workouts towards Izuku? I'm sure he can handle it," Nezu would say, looking on towards the teacher. "But Nezu, what type of workouts do you think a 4-year-old could complete? And he's basically 3, he just turned 4 today," would say, as Nezu would only glare on towards the teacher. "He is my son, after all, so why don't you stop talking like he's just a normal 3-year-old, Nezu would say. The teacher would jump back, defensive, shaking his hand, saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, Nezu, I didn't mean to upset you. I'll go train your son now," they would say hurriedly, grabbing Izuku and yanking him out of the office. As it would end up now being just in a field, as the teacher would end up telling Izuku that he wants him to run 3 laps around this field, and then he wants him to transform into some sort of cat-like thing or just some sort of animal and to attack him with his best shot. Izuku would nod his head as he would end up just starting to jog around the track. It was quite hard for the young Izuku, as he would barely end up managing to complete the track run, as he would entirely look over towards the teacher as his feet would end up wobbling, being weak after running so far, as Izuku would end up pulling himself together, transforming into a hawk, as he would end up swooping up into the air before flying right down at the teacher head first, before pulling back with his talons out, slashing down towards the teacher, before transforming into a lion and slashing his back as he had been behind him, as the teacher would end up falling down to one knee, holding his chest and back, having been scratched quite hard by it, as blood would start seeping through the teacher's clothing. Izuku would look on towards the teacher before just asking, "Did I go too hard? I'm really sorry about that," Izuku would say. The teacher with a soft voice would say, "It's okay, Izuku. You're fine." As we now cut 5 years into the future, Izuku had just been trained by this teacher for just around these 5 years, as Izuku's now 9. However, this teacher would end up retiring, and a new teacher would end up coming in. This teacher would be Shota Aizawa, as Izuku would also be taking quite the hard tests, being tutored by his father, Nezu. And so Izuku would be taking these tests, but they were just super easy to Izuku. Even Nezu at this age couldn't do something this good, he would think to himself. So he would start thinking even more before a light bulb would go off in his head. "Hey, Izuku!" Do you think you happen to have an hyper-intelligence quirk by any chance? Nezu would say, as Izuku would start to think for a moment. I don't know, maybe, would say, not throwing it out of the picture just yet. Nezu had some sort of intelligence work, however, Izuku could possibly have an even better one, so we would decide to give him his hardest test, as Izuku would end up looking through the problems before completely acing it within no time, getting every single question right. As we now see the 9-year-old Izuku walking over after being tutored for the day, as he would end up just seeing Shota Aizawa standing on a field. Izuku would ask Shota Aizawa where his other teacher was, however, Aizawa would only shake his head. Yeah, that teacher just retired. So, since I'm the new Class 1A teacher, I'm gonna be your teacher too. So, you're most likely gonna be training with some of the Class 1A students. Oh, don't think they're not gonna go easy on you. I've told them the 9-year-old's already doing better than most of them, so they're trying to hold back their spot as a hero, or just so that their ego can stay intact and to not be beaten by someone who's like 6 years younger than them. So, why don't you go ahead and begin with attacking me, just so I can get a feel of what your quirk is. Izuku would nod his head before getting into a stance. Aizawa would recognize it as some sort of martial arts stance, as Izuku would end up waiting for Aizawa to pull the first move, as Aizawa would end up erasing Izuku's quirk, as Izuku would grow impatient before rushing over towards Aizawa, turning into a lion and slashing at him. However, nothing would happen. Izuku turning into a lion all just happened up in his head, as Aizawa would end up smiling before punching Izuku right in the gut. Izuku would end up jumping back, holding his gut in pain, before wondering why he didn't turn into a lion. He would start to think for a moment before he would end up realizing it. Oh, so you have a quirk erasing quirk. That's quite the rare one. That's quite interesting, Aizawa, Izuku would say, as he would start to run circles around Aizawa. So Aizawa would end up erasing Izuku's quirk, keeping eyes on Izuku at all times, before Izuku would end up grabbing a pile of dust and throwing it right at Aizawa's eyes. Your eyes, they're your weak points, so without them, you're basically useless, Izuku would say, as he'd still end up running around him. However, Aizawa would continue moving back and forth, as if sensing where Izuku was. However, Izuku instantly realized that it was because of his footsteps. Aizawa could hear his footsteps, so he was tracking where Izuku was by them. So all of a sudden, Izuku would come to a screeching halt, before jumping up in the air, turning into a bird, a very small one too, flying up and over where he was, before softly landing onto the ground right behind Aizawa without making a noise. Right as this would happen, Aizawa would go right where he thought Izuku was, or right where Izuku just was, using just erasing, or not his erasing, but his scarf, trying to capture Izuku. However, nothing was there. As he would end up yanking his scarf back, he would realize no one was there, as suddenly he would end up turning around, finally getting all of the dust out of his eyes, to see a massive lion falling right on top of him, as a scratch would go right down Aizawa's face, and completely all the way back down towards his lower torso area, as Aizawa would end up just wobbling on his feet from how hard and fast the attack was. He would end up smiling to the young boy. That's quite the hard attack you have, Izuku, Aizawa would say, before falling down to the ground in pain. You're not going to be able to do that, any of the students, or else Nezu's going to be mad at me. So try to go a little bit less. Just try to not use as much power as you did on your attacks, alright, when you're forcing the students. There's no need to hurt anybody now, is there? Izuku would only smile down towards Aizawa before apologizing to him. Oh, sorry, Aizawa. I didn't mean to do it like that, would say, as Aizawa would only shake his head. It's alright, Izuku. As 6 years would end up passing, with Izuku continually being trained by Aizawa, while also just being in Class 1A in general, just learning the hero techniques from there. So he would be in the Class 1A classroom before going up to the Class 2A in Class 1 3A after he turned the age of 10 because Nezu deemed he was just eligible. However, he couldn't graduate just because of his age, being that it was too young. And Nezu didn't want him to be a hero at such a young age either, as he still was quite impulsive and did things that a younger person would do, so he needed more time to mature. So Izuku be walking in to the entrance exam. Nezu said that he couldn't just pass Izuku right away into UA. He still has to compete with the entrance exam too. So that Izuku would only nod his head before shutting his notebook, walking down where the entrance exam was being held that day. As we see a stretching Izuku, or he would end up sitting back down, as he would end up taking the written exam, easily flying through it as he had taken it multiple times before, passing it in under 30 minutes, turning it up front, as President Mike would only look just blatantly at Izuku. You really had to show off, Izuku. You couldn't have just sat there for an extra couple of minutes to make everyone think weren't doing us bad. Izuku would just laugh before walking back to his seat, sitting back down. As he would end up sitting there, he would start to think of a strategy that he could do to fight off against all of the robots. As finally 4 hours would pass as the written exam had finished, we see Izuku walking over to where the hero exam would be held, as he was stretching his limbs even more to hopefully get loose so that he wouldn't just not be loose when he was fighting and using his quirk. So once begun, as the doors would end up slowly opening, Izuku would turn into a cheetah, running as fast as he could right into the heart of the city, where tons of robots were located, as all of the robots would turn towards Izuku, aiming their weapons at him, as red dots would be located all around Izuku's body. However, before the robots could do anything, he would turn into the smallest animal he could. Turning into a tiny frog, he would end up on the ground as all of the robots would lose sight of him, as they would all fire off their weapons, causing them to have to recharge, as Izuku would hop over onto one of the three-pointers before turning into a gorilla, grabbing this three-pointer's head and spinning it around like just a massive weapon, as he would slam this robot into all of the other robots, causing them to either be destroyed or topple over, getting Izuku tons of points in the process, just around 45 of them. As Izuku would drop the robot he used as a hammer to smash all of the robots, he would end up walking around as a gorilla around the street, as one of the students would end up mistaking Izuku as sort of just another obstacle, as Izuku would end up transforming down into a tiny little bird flying up and away, as the student would end up looking up at them before smiling. "Oh, you're not getting away from me that easily," they would say, jumping up before trying to grab Izuku. However, Izuku would only turn down into a tiny little frog, as he would end up landing right onto this person's face, as Izuku would end up jumping up into the air before transforming into just some sort of fish, as he would end up moving his tail end of his body to slap the person right across the face, as they would end up falling back down to the ground with their cheek having just been slapped by some type of fish. Izuku would turn into a bird again, flying off to go and find just another pile of robots. As he would end up spotting them, he would end up transforming into a gorilla, falling down before smashing his fists down to the ground where the robots were, causing the ground to uproot and all of the robots to topple over, causing Izuku to easily stomp on them, destroying them. As Izuku, now with around 80 points, he would end up hearing the ground start to shake. He would lift his head up after smashing another robot's face in, as he would end up looking over his shoulder to see a massive zero-pointer was stomping its way over towards Izuku. As Izuku would land his foot over, turning around to see someone was trapped under a pile of rubble. He would look closer before he would end up seeing a small brunette-haired girl just trapped under a ton of boulders, as Izuku, acting quickly, would transform into to Cheetah running as fast as he could, getting to where she was, sliding over, picking up rock after transforming into a gorilla, grabbing her, throwing her over his shoulder, so he would end up running out of the way, putting her into an alleyway, as Izuku would end up looking up towards the robot that had continually started to move closer and closer towards him. Izuku would transform to a small bird, flying up to where the robot's head was, so he would turn himself into gorilla again, smashing a hole into the robot's metal before transforming into a frog, as he would end up going right into the robot's head, looking for just the core processor of the robot. As he would end up finding it in a ton of wires around it, Izuku would transform back into his gorilla, pulling all of the wires out, causing just the robot to malfunction, as he would end up falling backwards. Izuku would transform into a bird, as he would fly through the hole and gap, flying out before going back to the alleyway, where he would end up seeing the girl had passed out. Izuku would start to run around looking for Recovery Girl, as he would end up finding her, so he would then grab Recovery Girl and would fly her over to where the girl was, as Recovery Girl would be sitting on the back of a giant hawk. Izuku would end up dropping her off there, as she would end up taking care of her, as Izuku would end up being told that he can now just go home. As Izuku was walking out, he could hear all of the whispers of just everyone around him. They were whispering how strong he was and that he definitely made it into UA. He shouldn't have even had to take this exam. He was that good. Or just in complete shock that Izuku was just such a good natural hero. As Izuku would be walking back to where Nezu was, he would end up looking towards Nezu, as Nezu would only just laugh. Yeah, you didn't really have to take the exam. After seeing that, you definitely made it into UA. And I'd say by the looks of it, you're also the first-year representative. So good job, Izuku, Nezu would say, as Izuku would only just laugh. Thanks, Dad, he would say. As we now see Izuku walking back to his house, which his house was located on the UA campus, however, it was in the forest part of it, as Nezu had just decided to build a small house to live on it when he decided to build UA. So, with that, there was a small house that he and Izuku lived in, which was like on the boundary of the UA campus. However, Nezu had decided, or even telling Izuku, along with the rest of the students, that he was going to go around to all of the accepted examinees and to ask them if they can move into the UA campus just to ward off any villain attacks and so that they can be safer. Izuku would be sitting down on the couch as all of a sudden his stomach would end up rumbling. He would go to the fridge and pantry, opening it up, but would find that there was no food inside. So, doing the logical thing to do, he would go into town to find something to eat. Grabbing his wallet, he would end up walking out of the UA campus, going to just trying to find a local grocery store. As he would end up finding it, he would look for the best deal he could, as he didn't have as much money as, say, All Might. He wasn't rich, after all. So Izuku find the best deal he could, or just checking out, as he would end up having the food in a bag as he would be walking back to the UA campus. As Izuku would be under an overpass, all of a sudden, a massive slime monster made out of sludge would end up materializing out of nowhere, as he would now be standing, towering over Izuku. And that is where this part 1 comes to an end. I hope you all did enjoy it, and if you did, please consider subscribing. And if you're watching this in the future, part 2 should be linked in the comments section below. I thank you all for watching once again, and goodbye!